So today I'm talking about what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had to say in particular to Unitarian Universalists based on his May 1966 lecture to the Unitarian Universalism General Assembly, which is typically the largest gathering of Unitarian Universalists in the country. This lecture took place 2 years before Dr. King's death. It was during a time of the Cold War, the space race, the Vietnam War, and it was just a little over a year after the march from Selma to Montgomery. So it was a very, very fresh memory at that time. And it's that march that precipitated the Voting Rights Act. Now, Dr. King's lecture was an hour-long address of 6,600 words, so I will only be able to touch on a fraction of what he actually said. And I think it's important to note that his audience of Unitarian Universalists, of course, was not completely, but a vastly white audience. So today I'm going to take some quotes from the lecture and maybe do a little bit of reflection on what those words might mean to us today. And I invite you to also do that same type of reflection as you hear his words. Think about it, about what it means to you in the here and now, in the present. So Dr. King's opening remarks were the part that really kind of were tailored specifically to use. He was very complimentary at first. He said, "There are those wonderful moments in life when you speak before a group that is so near and dear to you that you don't feel like you have to engage in the art of persuasion." He recognized he was preaching to the choir for the most part. He said, "You don't feel like you are in the midst of strangers. You know that you are with friends. I can assure you that I feel that way tonight." So he then goes on to talk about his personal experience with Unitarian Universalism. And he said it began when he was attending Boston University in the early 1950s. Now, this is before the time when Unitarians and Universalists merged. So I think he's talking about mostly Unitarian, exposure at this time. But he visited the iconic and historic then Unitarian Arlington Street Church several times. And also in his remarks, he called by name 3 Unitarian ministers who had visited him and supported him earlier in his career during the Montgomery bus boycotts. And that's something that he appreciated because he said it was a very difficult and trying period in his ministry. So something else that he said to Unitarian Universalists, rather personal, is that he said, "I also want to acknowledge your massive participation in the events of Alabama during 1965. Now, this support expressed itself both before and after the death of your colleague and mine, the Reverend James Reeb, the Unitarian minister who was murdered in Selma." He says, he continues, "We grieved at the death of Mr. Reeb, and I was glad to participate in his memorial service in the historic Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma." And later in this same address, Dr. King also mentions Viola Liuzzo, who was the Unitarian layperson, volunteer from Detroit, who was murdered just after the march to Montgomery was completed, when she was actually simply driving marchers to the airport. So Dr. King gets on quickly to his subject of his address, titled, "Don't Sleep Through the Revolution." So he gives some advice on churches, what he thinks they need to do to stay awake during the Great Revolution. He's talking about a social revolution, not a physical one, the Great Social Revolution. And he begins by telling the story of Rip Van Winkle, the man who went up a hill, a mountain or something, and fell asleep for 20 years. And he talks about how when Rip Van Winkle went up the hill, he passed the town's inn, which was then called the King George Inn. 20 years later, when he came down the mountain, that inn was now named the George Washington Inn. So Rip Van Winkle had actually literally slept through the revolution. That's his key metaphor. And he says, "One of the great misfortunes of history is that all too many individuals and institutions find themselves in a great period of change and yet fail to achieve the new attitudes and outlooks that the new situation demands. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution. And there can be no gainsaying of the fact that a social revolution is taking place in our world today. We see it in our own nation, in the struggle against racial segregation and discrimination. Victor Hugo once said, "There is nothing more powerful in all the world than an idea whose time has come." The idea whose time has come today is the idea of freedom and human dignity. And so all over the world, we see something of a freedom explosion. And this reveals to us that we are in revolutionary times. An older order is passing away and a new order is coming into being. So my initial reaction to these remarks is that I feel like our country, instead of moving forward as he's describing 50 years ago, has been backsliding, right? That the new consciousness back then is now under attack and it's under threat. And it appears again, at least as of January 6th, we may be in revolutionary times, but not the social revolution Dr. King is talking about, right? It's quite opposite of what Dr. King is talking about. And that makes me very sad. I'm sad that after the great struggles forward in our country, there is not only still so much more to be done, but that it feels like we've been moving backwards. So much work has been quickly unraveled, or it appears that way. It's like this, there was a memo written 50 years ago and there's still people who never received it. But Dr. King gives advice to these churches he's talking about. He's talking about the UU church, but he's talking about the churches in general, their role in not sleeping through the revolution. And he gives 4 pieces of advice that will help to stay awake. He says, certainly the church has a great responsibility because when the church is true to its nature, it stands as a moral guardian of the community and of society. It has always been the role of the church to broaden horizons, to challenge the status quo, and to question and break mores if necessary. And by the way, I might add, that was kind of the work of Jesus too, right? He continues, I'm sure that we all agree that the church has a major role to play in this period of social change. So his first challenge to the church, he says, we are challenged to instill within the people of our congregations a world perspective. He goes on saying, through our scientific genius, we have made of this world a neighborhood. And now through our moral and ethical commitment, we must make it a brotherhood. We must live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. Live as brothers or perish as fools. He says this is a fact of life. No individual can live alone. No nation can live alone. And this was more than 50 years ago. This is before Unitarian Universalists even had their 7th principle regarding interdependence. Dr. King had it figured out. The 7th principle came in the 1980s. This idea that separation is not only damaging, it's an illusion. Dr. King went on to talk about his visit to India, where he experienced great beauty, but great poverty and hunger. And he talks about how that is not something that can be ignored by the United States. And you can also hear in his visit to India, I'm not sure if that's the one where he met Gandhi, but there's definitely an influence there. Dr. King says, all I'm saying is this, that all life is interrelated and somehow we are all tied together. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. He said, this is the interrelated structure of all reality. His second point about not sleeping through the revolution, he says it is necessary for the church to reaffirm over and over again the essential immorality of racial segregation. Now, we may look at that as antiquated, see ourselves as a post-segregated society. Well, many can beg to differ on that. Are our schools truly desegregated? Our churches are not desegregated. Our cities, no, not particularly. But even more so than focusing on racial segregation, you know, there's still things today we have to reaffirm over and over in our contemporary view. We're not talking as much about segregation today as we're talking about white supremacy culture, about institutional racism, about the implicit bias all white people carry by virtue of being born into a culture of white supremacy, the inner work white people have to do to be able to see the things they were never taught to see. And on a related note, Dr. King's third point is to refute the idea that there are superior and inferior races. Now, again, on the surface today, this seems like a really old argument that we should be past. But, you know, it's sad that there are individuals who are not past this argument. We've seen them on the, you know, the right fringes of our nation, but that's not the only point here. Dr. King said, it is out of this notion, he means the idea of superior, inferior races, that the whole doctrine of white supremacy came into being, and that the church must take a stand through religious education and other channels to direct the popular mind at this point, for there are some people who still believe this strange doctrine. Now, fortunately, I'm sure you don't have any Unitarian Universalists who believe this, but I think some of my Baptist brothers around the South believe it, and I would like to get you to help me out with some of my brothers. Now, I imagine this remark was probably met with great laughter in the General Assembly, and probably laughter with a little anxiety, because I really don't know how willing Unitarian Universalists would have been to try to change the thinking of white Southern Baptists back 50 years ago. But what he's really talking about, you know, he's naming white supremacy, and we can see 50 years later how it has manifested itself in our society. No, we don't really hear a lot of talk about superior and inferior races anymore, but it's much more insidious and subtle and invisible in all of our institutions and systems. And this is just as important. And Dr. King's final tidbits to stay awake through the revolution was that churches should move into the arena of social action. So even 50 years ago, this was not a new notion, especially to Unitarian Universalists. He said, to remain awake through this social revolution, the church must engage in strong action programs to get rid of the last vestiges of segregation and discrimination. And he talks about two myths we need to get rid of in order to be able to do social action well as churches. And the first one, he says, is the notion that legislation is not effective in bringing about the changes that we need in human relations. He says, this argument says that you're not going to change the heart in order to solve the problem, that you can't change the heart through legislation. He continues, well, there's some truth in this. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. The law cannot make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also. And so while the law may not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men. So it is necessary for the church to support strong, meaningful civil rights legislation. The second myth he is intent on busting is that we must deal with the idea of exaggerated progress, which pretty much knocked me to the ground in its relevance today. He said, on the other hand, we must realize the plant of freedom is only a bud and yet not a flower. The Negro is freer in 1966, but he is not yet free. There still are stubborn, difficult problems to deal with all over the country. I'm appalled that some people feel that the civil rights struggle is over because we have a 1964 civil rights bill and a voting rights bill. Over and over again, people ask, what else do you want? They feel that everything is all right. Now, I think here Dr. King is too polite to say it is white people who are asking those questions. What else do you want? They feel that everything is all right. You know, he's talking about that. And this idea makes me think of when, you know, Black, Indigenous people of color would obviously be like, no, back then things are not okay. Just as they're often now like, things are not okay, white people. I think of the Obama administration, right? People thought that, oh, we've arrived. We are a post-racial nation. Yay for us. That was definitely a white people attitude, right? Black, Indigenous people of color were going, oh yeah, let's see about this. And you know, 8 years later, look what happens. The backlash arrives, right? We see this in Black Lives Matter too. You know, people are protesting. We see that this bias is in our system of policing and how it ends in the unnecessary deaths of unarmed Black people. This is just an extension. You know, we may think we're in this age where we have arrived, but there is so much evidence to the contrary. So the next thing in his address that Dr. King touches on is what we now call income inequality. He said, while there is great affluence all around, there still are stubborn depths of poverty, deprivation, and despair. These are stubborn, difficult problems, and yet they are problems that must be tackled. He encourages churches to support demonstrations. Again, he was saying this is not a post-demonstration age in 1966. He asks them to support demonstrations regarding poverty and related social problems. And, you know, I must say 50 years later, income inequality, and this isn't just about race, overall income inequality is greater than ever. But you can see his work, his ideas being continued, you know, through the work of Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign, right? This is, I think, is a natural progression of these same ideas that honestly, this work that Dr. King did not live to see through. He also talked about the theory of nonviolence, the case for nonviolence. He said that I'm still convinced that nonviolence is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom and human dignity. It has power because it has a way of disarming the opponent. It exposes his moral defenses. It weakens his morale. And at the same time, it works on his heart and on his conscience, and he just doesn't know what to do. There's another good thing about nonviolence. Through it, a person can use moral means to procure moral ends. There are still those who sincerely believe that the end justifies the means. Hello. No matter what the means happen to be, no matter how violent or how deceptive or anything else they are. Nonviolence would say that the morality of the ends is implicit in the means, and that in the long run of history, destructive means cannot bring about constructive ends. Hello there, January 6th. But I still believe, I'm still a believer. I believe in the high road, in the moral high ground. I think back to how the public opinion really, awareness came about because the police brutality in Selma was televised and people could witness it. They could see the brutality against unarmed, peaceful, unantagonistic, well, they might have been antagonistic, but peacefully antagonistic people, right? That is when the moral argument became powerful. And I think that's one of the reasons it succeeded. And I think we as a people have to honor that tradition and be part of the nonviolent tradition. Otherwise, we are sacrificing our deepest morally held, our deepest morals and our deepest values about who we are as a people. So Dr. King finished up with something I really like, which is he's talking about the ethic of love. And as we're entering what Unitarian Universalists called 30 days of love for the past 12 years, the days marked between the MLK Jr. holiday and Valentine's Day, are the days we focus on justice through love and what that can teach us. So here's what Dr. King had to say about the love ethic. He said, most revolutions in the past have been based on hope and hate. I think the different thing about the revolution that has taken place in our country is that it has maintained the hope element, and at the same time, it has added a dimension of love. He goes on to talk about agape love, love the definition of which is understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all, and overflowing love which seeks nothing in return. He says when one rises to love on this level, he loves a person who does the evil deed while hating the deed. I believe that in our best moments in this struggle, we have tried to adhere to this. In some strange way, we have been able to stand up in the face of our most violent opponents and say, in substance, we will match your capacity to inflict suffering with our capacity to endure suffering. We will meet your physical force with our soul force. Do to us what you will, and we will still love you. Folks, this is me speaking now. This is really hard. Like, this is one of my greatest aspirations, to be able to feel this way, right? I mean, I just thought I'd lift that up, that how hard this truly is and what deep spiritual work that is. Do to us what you will, and we will still love you. Be assured that we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And one day we will win our freedom. We will not only win freedom for ourselves, we will so appeal to your heart and your conscience that we will win you in the process. And our victory will be a double victory. With a nonviolent method guiding us on, we can go on into that brighter day when justice will come. Enduring suffering. I think that's over and over. I think that's a lot braver than people who show up places with guns. Just saying. Unfortunately, I don't think that dual victory has yet been achieved, but I believe one day it is possible. But the work is not done. So I'm going to finish off today with reading a lot of Dr. King's conclusion to his speech. And then I'm going to give a very brief conclusion of my own, much briefer than him because he is the star of the day. And I find his words still very inspiring. He says, "Let me say in conclusion that I have not despaired of the future. I believe firmly that we can solve the problems of people's inhumanity to each other. I know there are still difficult days ahead, and they are days of glorious opportunity. Our goal for America is freedom." And then speaking for the African American community, he says, "Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed in Plymouth, we were here. Before Jefferson etched across the pages of history the words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. Before the beautiful words of the Star-Spangled Banner were written, we were here. For more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters in the midst of the most oppressive and humiliating conditions. And yet, out of a bottomless vitality, they continued to grow and develop. If the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face will surely fail. We're going to win our freedom because both the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands." You know, I just want to step out and say that he is calling both on the heritage of our imperfect, but nation with very, very high ideals, right? He's calling from within. The revolution is from within the scope of American ideals and religious ideals as well. And he finishes up saying, "And we can sing, we shall overcome, because somehow we know the arc of the moral universe is long." Quote originally from Unitarian minister Theodore Parker. He says, "The universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed will rise again. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. We will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood and speed up that day when all of God's children all over our nation and the world will be able to walk the earth as brothers and sisters. And then we can sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. And that's the end of his address, which I imagine was not met with a standing ovation and thunderous applause. And of course, as we all can see from this, that the work that Dr. King described more than 50 years ago, a few years before I was born, is still a work in progress. And that work is in our hands to continue. Time really has proven that that arc of the universe that bends towards justice is truly long. It's agonizingly long, you know? And it's up to us to bend it towards justice. I don't think it's going to just bend itself, right? I don't think it would have just bent itself. So we really can't stop. And we really have to stop thinking about short-term and short-term goals. We have to work even if the fruits of our labor are not recognized in our lifetimes. We owe that to future generations. You know, like Dr. King said, I truly hope that when truth is crushed, you know, it will rise again. I hope we will achieve the unity expressed in that dream. But again, that is up to us. I wonder, you know, are we truly up to what Dr. King asked of us more than 50 years ago? Because the revolution is not over, folks. You all know that, right? It never actually ended. It is still going on, and we still can't afford to sleep. You know, our human family, our one human family, is still in crisis, and it is still in danger, especially now. And we have to do what we must to take care of our country, our democracy that is under threat, for those values of freedom and equality and justice for all. We have to take care of our country, and we have to take care of our family that is in such our human family that is in such distress and disarray right now. I hope we can live up to the challenge. May it be so, and blessed be.